According to Iroquois legend, this confederation began before European contact with the actions of a Mohawk sachem named Hiawatha. Prior to the creation of the confederation, there had been a great deal of warfare among the Indian tribes of the region, and Hiawatha had lost several family members. After several days of fasting in the woods, he received a vision, and was later able to develop a plan to eliminate the vengeance which was common when a family member died in combat. He also developed a plan which called for cooperation among the different Indian nations rather than conflict. Eventually, this made the Iroquois one of the strongest and most feared Indian groups in the eastern woodlands at the time of European contact. For more information about Hiawatha, you can click on the hyperlink below. Politically, the Iroquois made decisions using a council form of government. Delegates from each of the Indian tribes in the Confederacy attended council meetings to discuss issues until a consensus could be reached. The homes they lived in were longhouses. They were often about 25 feet in width, but could range up to 200 feet in length. Several families would live under the roof of one longhouse. This photo shows a partial reconstruction of an Iroquois town from the 16th century. Iroquois towns usually consisted of several rows of longhouses surrounded by a defensive wall. These were strong, weather-resistant living quarters, which included as many as 3 to 5 fireplaces to keep families inside warm on cold winter days. Baskets, pots, pelts, and food were also stored inside the longhouse. Several other traits were common among the Iroquois. Property was owned communally. Europeans commented that there was no need for poorhouses among the Iroquois because if a family didn't have enough, others shared with them. There was also a division of labor between men and women. Men hunted, fished, and were warriors. Women farmed and gathered food products. Farming was a key component of their food supply, as a great deal of their food came from agricultural goods. Because women were the farmers, and they relied so heavily on farmed products, this may explain why Iroquois women also held a great deal of political power. There are a few examples of the power held by Iroquois women. First, descent was matrilineal. In other words, unlike Europeans, children traced their ancestry through their mothers, not their fathers. This was easily seen when young couples were married. They would move to the longhouse of the bride's family. Secondly, women could easily divorce their husbands. A young man might learn his wife wanted a divorce as he returned from a trip to find his personal belongings outside his longhouse rather than within it. Finally, while women were not elected to the council positions, they selected the delegates who did represent their tribes and very much influenced debate. If a council delegate chose a position unpopular with the women, he might find himself recalled from that office. Next, we'll explore some of the characteristics concerning Native Americans living in what is now New England. In many ways, based on climate and geographic characteristics, New England can be divided into northern and southern regions. For our purposes, in general, the states included in northern New England include Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. The circled area on this map shows a close-up of northern New England. Indians living in northern New England lived exclusively as hunters and gatherers. This made life difficult because they were unable to preserve as much food throughout the year. To compensate, they practiced mobility. In the spring and summer months, they often lived in villages near the coastlines and relied on seafood to make up a large portion of their diet. In the fall and winter, they broke into smaller family units and moved to the interior where they depended more on hunting beaver and other larger game animals for food and pelts. They simply accepted the possibility that by late spring there may not be as much to eat as gathering food became more difficult and game animals became more scarce. Because they didn't have as much food, their numbers were smaller than those of their neighbors to the south. It's estimated the population of Native Americans living in northern New England was 15,000 to 20,000 in 1600. Indians living in southern New England lived in the area circled on this map, the present-day states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Indians living in southern New England may not have lived far from their neighbors to the north, but their lifestyles contrasted. Instead of living strictly as hunters and gatherers, they also farmed. At times, over half of their diet came from farmed goods. This allowed them to store food for longer periods of time, so they didn't experience these starving times which often plagued Indians to the north in the late winter and early spring. Overall, even though the amount of territory included in both northern and southern New England were approximately the same, their numbers were larger than those who lived farther to the north, as you can see with these comparative population statistics. Farming practices among Native Americans living in southern New England and in other parts of North America were different than those employed by Europeans. In order to plant crops, fields needed to be cleared. This was often done by women who girdled trees and set fire to wood around the base of the trees to bring them down. On the side you see an illustration of different varieties of corn or maize. It was one of the so-called three sisters of Native American agriculture. The trio was corn, beans, and squash. They were usually planted together in the same fields. This actually had many added benefits. Corn drew nutrients, like nitrogen, from the soil, as beans added nitrogen. While this helped to delay soil exhaustion to some extent, by clearing fields for agriculture and planting specific crops, Indians living in southern New England had a major impact on their environment. Next, we'll focus on another American Indian group. These will be Native Americans living along the Pacific Northwest coast. The area to be discussed began in southern Alaska, spreading along the west coast of British Columbia in both Washington and Oregon, all the way down to northern California. The first trait to be addressed is the fact that Pacific Northwest Coast Indians lived exclusively as hunters and gatherers. They didn't farm to obtain their food. Usually, if this was the case, people would have to work incredibly hard just to survive. However, there was such an abundance of food sources in the region that Pacific Northwest Coast Indians were incredibly wealthy compared to other Native Americans. For additional information about Indians of the Pacific Northwest Coast, you may click on the hyperlink below to a website sponsored by the University of Washington. One item contributing to this tremendous wealth would be the easy access to timber as a resource. Cedar trees in particular grew to tremendous sizes along the northwest coast, and they added a great deal to the Indians' technology. These trees could often reach 250 feet in height while achieving a diameter of 18 feet. There were multiple uses of both the bark and lumber included in the tree. Bark was often used to make baskets and clothing. When soaked in water for a period of time, the bark would become quite soft, and babies often wore diapers made from the bark of these cedar trees. Canoes were the primary mode of transportation, and canoes of all sizes were made from these enormous trees. Indians of the northwest coast also lived in longhouses, which were very large, permanent structures made of cedar. They housed many families and could be as long as 100 feet in length and 40 feet wide. Seafood was the backbone of their diet, and in many cases salmon was the most important staple. Salmon could be caught in a variety of ways, but one of the most effective took place when they were spawning. Individuals in 2 canoes could paddle upstream while dragging a net between them to capture as many fish as possible. Once caught, they were prepared in a variety of ways. The key was to remove any moisture from the fish so they could be preserved for months. This was done by either smoking or drying the salmon. A typical meal might include smoked salmon dipped in oil. The key was abundance. Not only was there salmon, but many other fish. Shellfish, such as crabs, clams, and oysters, were also common. In some areas, whales were even hunted. Pacific Northwest Coastal Indian Society was very unique among Indian people. Society was very stratified. Each person occupied a different social rank. Even though their society was highly stratified, there were really only 2 social classes. Individuals were either free or slaves. In direct contrast to the Iroquois, who lived by more of a communal basis, free people's position in Northwest Coastal Indian Society was determined by an individual's wealth. Just as wealth plays an important role in determining one's place in American society today, it was crucial for Indians living along the Pacific coast. This chart provides a bit of a visual aid to demonstrate rank in society. People at the top had the most wealth, and below those would be individuals who had less wealth. However, at the very bottom of this ladder were slaves. Occupation could also impact one's position in society. For example, among the whalers who lived along the Washington Peninsula, if an individual held a special skill, such as a harpooner, which was very prestigious, this could raise one's rank in society. This lecture has covered a wide range of subjects addressing Native Americans.